The man who wrote the book on animal liberation is embarking on a global speaking tour in advance of a new update of his book. Details on all that and a conversation on what needs to be done after 50 years of a movement. Author-philosopher Peter Singer, direct from Australia, is next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this inside look at animal rights, brought to you by PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's episode, Peter Singer, the author, the philosopher, often seen as the one who helped put animal rights on the map. Now he's about to embark on a speaking tour that will take him from London to New York, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, and San Francisco in advance of the release of the update of Animal Liberation. Animal Liberation Now. Details on how to get tickets for the speaking tour at thinkinc.org.au, and pre-sales of the book are all in our show notes. A frequent PETA Podcast guest, Singer spoke to me from Australia recently about the update Animal Liberation Now and all the changes that have and haven't happened in the movement the last 50 years. Here's my conversation with author-philosopher Peter Singer on the PETA Podcast. Thank you for this return visit.
Well, I'm delighted to help. Obviously, the work that PETA does is very close to my heart and very close to something that I've been working on intellectually as well for the last 50 years.
Yeah, well, let's talk about this first fully updated and revised version of Animal Liberation Now since 1990. What did you find has changed and what has remained the same? And I know it must be a long list, or maybe it's a short list, I'm not sure, but what surprised you about what has changed and what has remained the same?
Well, what everyone says when you say, I did this work a long time ago and I'm writing an update, everybody says, oh, well, there are so many more vegans around now and there's such much better availability of plant-based foods in the stores and everybody understands what the word vegan means. And that's all true. In fact, when the first edition came out, nobody knew what the word vegan meant at all. And there certainly weren't sort of sections of supermarket aisles or cabinets saying vegan, plant-based, anything like that. So that's terrific. And it's much easier, of course, for vegans nowadays to walk into a restaurant and be sure that they will get something they can eat. All of that is very good news. There have also been some changes in the way animals are treated. I think Americans are not, unfortunately, in the lead in this area, although you're now on the West Coast. If you're in California, that is one of the leading states because California, as a result of those referendums, has passed laws restricting some of the worst forms of factory farming and animal confinement. But the real leader, I think, in that has been the European Union, which enacted laws on this quite a few years ago now. And so all 27 countries of the European Union, plus the United Kingdom, because even though they left the Union, they've retained similar laws, do have somewhat better conditions for animals than they used to. That is, the worst forms of really close confinement, like the standard wire cage for laying hens, the individual stalls for sows and for veal calves that were too narrow for them even to turn around. They have been prohibited in the European Union, but not in the US, except for, I think, 8 or 9 states.
You mentioned some things that are different than when you began in 1990 with the original publication of Animal Liberation Now. It almost seems like it isn't enough. That we haven't gone as far as we should have.
Definitely, we haven't gone as far as we should have. That's very obvious when you start looking into this. In that sense, it's disappointing that, say, in the United States, the majority of laying hens are still in those standard wire cages, so cramped that they can't even fully spread their wings. They don't have any kind of nesting boxes to lay an egg in, which is a basic need for hens and which the European Union has legislated for. There has to be a sheltered, protected space within the enclosure for the hens to lay in. That's not the case in the US. Sows are still often in individual stalls where they can't turn around, which is prohibited in the European Union. So, it's disappointing. And even in the area of the use of animals in experiments, where I had believed that the introduction of the institutional animal care and use committees had made a big difference. Steven Pinker, the Harvard psychologist, actually had written in one of his books that one of the worst things he ever did was an experiment when he was a graduate student in which, at the directions of his professor, he tortured a rat to death. And he then said, but that would never happen now because of these animal care and use committees. He says that's all changed. Well, unfortunately, there are still animals essentially being tortured to death for no good reason in US labs and US testing. So there's still a lot of work to be done in that area as well.
So you talked about those animal care use committees. People in the biz would know them as Aya cooks. They have been criticized as really been filled with too many insiders, perhaps, and maybe being much more liberal for the researchers, and maybe even not strong enough advocates for animals in some cases.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And again, the US is lagging behind at least some European countries, which have stronger requirements for animal welfare representatives on committees. I think the US committees have requirements for a lay person or an outsider, but, maybe that's the chairman's golfing partner. Who knows? It's not, whereas in other countries, including here in Australia, there have to be representatives of animal welfare organisations. They might not always be the most radical animal welfare organisations that they're representatives of, but at least, they're representative of an SPCA or something like that. So they have some concern for animals. So, I think there's a long way to go in that area as well.
You're kind of the de facto person who has sort of put animal rights on the map, have written about it, have written this book that has become, I don't want to necessarily call it the Bible, but it is sort of a standard bearer that people look to, Animal Liberation Now. You see where your update is now, and you have to say that given the fact that we now acknowledge that, there are these animals, billions of animals at stake, and we haven't moved far enough. Who is the villain that we're fighting? Is it human nature? Is it capitalism? What is the thing that prevents people from seeing the moral right of the animals and that prevents us from doing the right thing?
It's a very interesting question. And I think it's not just capitalism, because we've treated animals badly in pre-capitalist societies, and under Soviet communism, animals were badly treated. It's a moral blind spot that we have. Just as we now recognize the moral blind spot that the slave states and the slave traders had, 150 years ago. But we don't recognize the blind spot that we have for animals and the way they're treated. And I think that is, in a sense, it was perhaps difficult for the Southerners who thought that their economies were dependent on slaves to really look objectively at what they were doing to African people who were captured and brought to them. And it's difficult for us to look objectively at animals because most people are eating them, and they don't really want to think about alternatives to eating them. They don't want to cause troubles with their families. Younger people say, well, what will my parents say if I say I'm not going to eat this? There's a culture in which this is an acceptable practice, and which it's only slowly being questioned by an increasing number of people.
Yeah, I mean, one of the changes that has happened in terms of capitalism and the emergence of fake meat into the marketplace, and just looking at the examples of things like Beyond Meat and Impossible Meats, they've had some struggles in the open market in terms of, there was an initial excitement that maybe these products would be the answer for a lot of things, not just veganism but also maybe climate. There's an excitement about it, but in the marketplace, these companies have struggled in the open market of capitalism. What do you think that says about trying to reach some kind of moral answer using fake meats for example?
Well, one problem certainly is, and any fair-minded economist would admit this, that a problem with the market economy is that externalities are not priced in. Now, that's a technical term that economists use, but if, for example, you buy beef, then the damage that the beef production does to the climate, and therefore the harm that it does to hundreds of millions of people around the world, especially people in low-income countries who are more dependent on rainfall patterns, and they're in hot countries, and if it gets any hotter, they won't be able to work outside. Those costs are not priced into what the consumer pays or the producer's costs. So that's a flaw in the capitalist system. That's true. And if it were priced in, then the Beyond Burgers and the Impossible Burgers and other plant-based products would be coming in more cheaply than they are now, and they would be economically competitive with beef, which as yet they're not. I'm hoping that they will be as they scale up, even despite the fact that the externalities were not priced in. But really, what is needed is a government regulation that carbon emitters have to price in the harm that they're doing. And that should be just as true for meat producers as for fossil fuel consumers. We need to have those kinds of carbon quotas or carbon taxes to price those externalities in.
Sounds like maybe that might be the answer to get us through this moral blind spot. Because as long as there is a moral blind spot, we will be spending the way we always have spent and consuming the way we always have consumed, and also producing products in the way we've always done so, unless maybe there was some kind of government coming in to say, hey, we got to do it this other way.
Yeah, that's right. And I still do hope that can happen. As I said, it happened in the European Union. There was strong pressure from the public to do something about factory farming, about at least the worst abuses of factory farming. I'm not suggesting that factory farming doesn't exist in the European Union. Of course it does. And it still gives a bad life for billions of animals. But some of those worst forms, as I said, have been prohibited. And there is talk now of the European Union moving to be entirely cage-free for animals. I would hope that maybe Americans would start to feel a little bit of shame. How is it that we're lagging behind European countries, countries that we've thought were more cruel to animals, right? If you talk about Spain, for example, right? The first thing people think about if they're concerned about animals is, they have bullfights in Spain. That's horrendous. They must have terrible attitudes to animals. But actually, if you look at animals in general in Spain, they're far better off than animals in general in the United States. Because, yes, there's a few hundred bulls who die cruelly in the bull ring, but there aren't the hundreds of millions of hens in cages and pigs and other animals confined in the way that they are in the United States.
Yeah. So if you're saying the government may have to step in to really be the catalyst to bring about the real changes, you're really saying that this is a political question now. Right, because there will be opponents, and saying no. We're hunters. We love to eat meat. We love to do things the way we and then there's going to be the industry folks, right, who will send in their lobbyists to say we can't do this other way. It's a political question then to get us over this moral blind spot.
It is at least in part, yes, and I think. You just were referring to the lobbyists, and the amount of money that goes into American politics is clearly part of that lobbying. And that, I think, might be the explanation for why the European Union has better laws to protect farm animals than the United States, because money doesn't play as big a role in politics in the European Union. And it's significant that, I mentioned California and its better laws for farm animals, and the other 8 or 9 states that have better laws. All but one of those are states with a mechanism for citizens-initiated referenda. And, of course, that's how things were changed in California. And when these issues get put to the vote, you get big majorities. against the way we're treating animals. So in California, there was like over 60%, I think 63% majority for changing the laws. And more recently in Massachusetts, there was a similar motion put up, and I think it got 78%, which is almost unheard of in this polarized United States for anything. But you can do that in states which have those opportunities for referenda. But what do you do in other states that don't? And above all, what do you do federally where there is no provision for a referendum? And that's where the lobbying plays such a big role. So we really need a counter-animal lobby that is just as powerful, just as well-funded, and just as influential to counter the agribusiness lobby.
Well, definitely, if we want to get all the way to the kind of answer we want in terms of animals in experimentation or animals in farming. But let's concentrate on some of the positive things. Give us some examples in the areas of animal experimentation and factory farming that give you some hope that there is some real change that we can build on and that can give us some momentum going forward.
Again, you can look at those states, which California is the biggest, that have passed these laws allowing all animals to be able to stretch their limbs fully, for instance. So that gets the laying hens out of those small wire cages. And they have to be able to do that without touching either another animal or the sides of the enclosure. So that gives also the sows room to be able to walk around, turn around, and veal calves as well. And generally, I should say the veal calves in the US, it has responded a bit to public pressure and to the really terrible image that the veal industry deservedly had. So calves usually can turn around now, but they're still kept isolated for part of their lives, and they're very social animals. And the separation of the cow and the calf is a real problem because they're mammals, and the mothers call for their calves repeatedly when the calves are taken away. Yeah, there are some positives we can talk about there. There was a recent legislation that said that the FDA should not require animal experiments before approving new drugs and substances. It's not clear to me how much of a change that is going to make, because it may not require it, but it may still make it more difficult to assess the safety of a product unless you do that. So I think a lot of people will continue to use animal experiments, which are often miserable, cause the deaths of the animals or make them very sick. They'll continue to do that because that's what they know how to do, that's what they've been doing, and to switch to the alternatives may not be the first thing that they want to do.
Yeah, but considering some of the work that, say, PETA has done through the research modernization deal and, exposing the fact that the animal experimentation can be easily replaced with non-animal experiments that are more effective or more efficient. How does the old way survive, given some of that new information, that new scientific information?
Yeah, it does just hang in there. You're right. Despite the new information, animals are not directly comparable to the results of drugs with humans. And there's a lot of misleading results with animals, and you can actually sometimes do better with alternatives, non-animal alternatives. It's kind of crazy that it does hang on there, but I think sort of the safety in doing what we've always done rather than striking out and doing something different is probably a reason why it continues.
Well, that's one of the humps, in addition to the idea of, the moral blind spot. But what might get people to the other side? What is the convincing thing that might lead people to an animal rights vision?
I think recognizing that we don't need to treat animals in the way we do, that this is not a life-saving or urgent thing. And this is a point that I made already in the original edition of Animal Liberation, that in terms of feeding grain or soybeans to animals, this is just wasteful. We're just wasting food. We get less food value out of the animals, including less protein, than we put into them. And similarly with experiments on animals, as I was just saying, a lot of scientists are now saying, yes, we've learned a lot about curing cancer in mice or what causes cancer in mice, but that doesn't equate to human beings. It's been an enormous waste of taxpayer funds to do a lot of this animal research. So, maybe these kinds of economic motives and recognition that this is bad for the planet, for the climate, raising so many animals. Maybe those things are coming together, and we will get a kind of confluence of different events that lead people to rethink the way we're treating animals.
Yeah, but as a philosopher, does it kind of astound you that people in view of really convincing facts and logic will refuse to do what's good for not just humans but also for the animals?
I suppose you could say that going back 50 years to when I first started thinking about animals, it's been a learning process for me about just how stubborn and, if you like, how status quo biased humans can be, how reluctant they are to make fundamental changes, either in the way they think or the way they eat or some of their general prejudices that they have about non-human animals. So I do think things have been changing, but the changes have been so much slower than I had hoped when I started thinking about this area.
You spend a good deal of time discussing the word that you first introduced to the world, speciesism, and it's good to bring it up now because I guess you can have that moral blind spot if you're not thinking about certain species that you eat or that certain species that you test on or experiment on. Tell me about the evolution of the word that you coined, speciesism, and how is it faring in today's world like you might have thought, or is it faring well at all?
Well, let me first give credit to the person who really did coin it, because I didn't invent it. When I was a graduate student in Oxford in 1971, at top of it had this word I'd never seen before, speciesism. It was by a man called Richard Ryder, who later wrote a book called Victims of Science, and had a long career in the animal welfare movement. But I've always acknowledged that he invented the word. I popularized it through animal liberation. And I think the value of the word, and I thought this the first moment I saw it, is to make the analogy with racism and with sexism, because pretty much everybody now, of course there's a few open racists around, but very few, and everybody rejects the idea of racism, and most people reject the idea of sexism as well. So I think that we ought to see this as a parallel kind of situation. I'm not saying it's completely the same in all respects. It's obviously not. But when you have a group of beings who are more powerful than another group of beings, and they then develop an ideology that they regard as justifying their exploitation of those beings, even to the point of capturing them, confining them, and using them as tools, which is, of course, exactly what happened with slavery, then, we can see that that's wrong. When we look at that in the case of slavery, we say it's terrible that people did this. This was a huge blind spot. We talk now about reparations, even for the many generations after slavery became illegal in the United States. So we see this blind spot, but we don't then say, yeah, but what ethical blind spots do we have today in 2023? And I think the obvious one is our attitudes to animals, our speciesist attitudes to animals, I would say. The idea that we think that our species is the one with moral worth and moral significance, and other species, even if they're capable of suffering and of feeling pain or of enjoying their lives, just don't count. And we talk about human rights all the time, the importance of human rights, but we don't talk about animal rights, or we don't say, well, why do rights stop at the boundary of our species? Why should that be? So I think the concept of speciesism is an important one to get people to see that this is a blind spot that we still have today.
Yeah, you mentioned racism or sexism, and I think it is, the idealistic notion is, yes, we've overcome as bad as it's been in racism or sexism, but on the other hand, you can't say that we have totally eliminated racism or sexism. So what we have is an evolution of what is acceptable. Do you see that as the same route for speciesism, that maybe we'll, take some little advancements, but it'll be like racism or sexism, that there will still be some that we will allow and that we will accept as this is okay?
Well, yes, I think it'll be a long path until we completely eliminate speciesism, just as it's been a very long path. And we, as you say, we haven't completely eliminated racism. It's still there. But, making these distinctions in legislation, that has ended, right? The idea that if you are African descent, that you don't have the rights of other people, and indeed that you can be enslaved and used as a mere tool by others, which was legal in many parts of the United States and in many other countries as well. That's gone. And what I want is something similar for animals, that the idea that we own animals as property, that we can lock them up and confine them in various ways, that we can kill them for food when that's not part of our survival or necessary or self-defense or anything like that. I think, it's going to be a long time before we can change those laws, but I hope that eventually we'll get there.
Yeah, I think as you were mentioning that, yes, of course, the Constitution bans slavery, but you can talk to civil rights activists who will point to the way African American men are incarcerated or the way African Americans are treated by police, et cetera, et cetera. We have not eliminated racism, but yeah, we can't enslave people. That's not good. And sexism, yeah, women have the right to vote. Sexism, you can say, yes, we've made great strides there, but women are still paid, a fraction of what, men get paid in the workplace and, and et cetera, et cetera. So maybe we'll have that kind of incremental thing with speciesism and with animals, that we'll see some gains on the broad picture, but the fight continues. It seems like it's a lifetime fight.
It probably is. You're right. These are long struggles, but I do feel that in the case of racism and sexism, we have got over a huge hump. That is to give equal rights and recognize the idea of equal rights where for people of different races, recognize equal rights for women, and yes, implementing that and ensuring real equality is still a struggle. But we are very far from recognizing equal rights or even equal consideration of interests for non-human animals. And I think that principle of equal consideration of interests is a critical one. We shouldn't be saying, oh, yes, I know I'm causing pain to this animal, but it's just an animal, so it doesn't matter.
Right.
That's the kind of attitude we still have. And nobody would ever publicly say that about a person of a different race or a different gender, that, because they're of a different race or gender, the fact that I'm hurting them doesn't matter. That's kind of, you couldn't survive in public life if you said that, but you clearly can survive if you say that about animals.
Yeah, there's a kind of a speciesist thinking in terms of how we deal with different animals. Like, we love our dogs and cats. We may not be crazy about some other animals. We'll eat the other animals. You talk about eating a dog, which they do in some quarters of the world. It makes people in the United States a little queasy and downright. That's when they get their ire up. But as far as other animals, it's not the same. How do you explain that?
Yeah, that's another kind of speciesism. Actually, I've drawn a distinction between anthropocentric speciesism, which is speciesism in favor of our own species, in favor of humans, as against all other animals. And that certainly exists. And even with dogs and cats, obviously, they don't have the same status as humans. And then there is what I sometimes call species bias, that we have biases towards the animals who we are close to and love, and that's particularly dogs and cats and horses too. And we object to treating them in certain ways, but we don't object to doing much worse things to cows and pigs and sheep and chickens and fish, for that matter, a vast number of fish who, we have very little empathy for, although they're clearly sentient beings and they can clearly suffer. And the growth of aquaculture, which is just factory farming for fish, is one of the things that has happened since I first published Animal Liberation. That really means there's a lot more suffering that we're inflicting on animals in that area than we used to.
Tell me about the updates in terms of animal experimentation, just segueing into the forms of animals or the species that get tested on, like the mice. Like if you say something like, I feel for the mice, if you say that publicly, a lot of people, I would say a majority would say, you're crazy. But that is a form of speciesism. Tell me about your ideas about animal experimentation have changed since the beginning of since when you first wrote Animal Liberation.
I've become more aware of how widespread this is and how it, China is becoming a major experimenting nation now, just as it's also changed in terms of far more factory farming than they used to be. Again, the European Union, which is a leader in protecting animals in the field of experimentation as well as in farming, some European experimenters have actually moved to China. A noted German researcher who was doing experiments on monkeys moved his whole laboratory from Germany to China because the laws are more lax there. And I have seen reports of US scientists who are working together with Chinese scientists on experiments on monkeys in China that I suspect they would not be allowed to do in the United States. So this is one concerning loophole in the way things are going. And you mentioned the fact that people don't take seriously mice. So this is an extraordinary gap in the US laws about experiments in animals. In fact, we don't really even know how many animals are used in experiments in the United States because the Department of the United States Department of Agriculture that regulates animal experiments does not have the authority from Congress to include rats and mice, who are the vast majority of animals used in experiments. According to some estimates, more than 99% of the animals used in experiments in the US are rats and mice. Others say, no, it's only 95%, but whatever figure you take, it's, 19 out of 20 of the animals used in experiments are not covered by the law. And that's, as far as I know, that's unique to the United States, that they've carved out this exception for the majority of animals used in experiments in the very laws that regulate experiments on animals.
Yeah, and what's really surprising is if you have ever seen a mouse, you see a mouse or a rat, they're alive, they're living. That's a life. I mean, it's hard to imagine, well, there's an experiment, the animal lives, dies, and not care. It's hard to not care about that unless you are a true speciesist type person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, unless you say, well, they're mice, they're pests, whatever that means. We don't like them. They might come into our homes and eat things, but of course the mice bred for labs never get into our homes. And they are sentient beings. They're mammals. They are vertebrates. They have nervous systems very like ours. There's no doubt that they feel pain. And in fact, some of the experiments that I describe in the new book, Animal Liberation Now, are experiments that presuppose that they are stressed and in pain because they're experiments done in order to do things like create some model of post-traumatic stress disorder, which, if they didn't feel any stress, you wouldn't be able to use them. But researchers obviously think they can use them.
Yeah. So I guess that's one of the things that's going to be in your book. You're also doing a speaking tour. What's your message on the tour as you lead up to the publication of the book?
Yes, I will be speaking in the United States. I'll be speaking in Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York. They're ticketed events in large venues. You can find them online. And I'll be using these to try to inform the public and, if you like, inspire the public, encourage the public, arouse the public to demand change in the areas that I'm talking about, to get them to recognize that although I've been writing about animal liberation for a long time, the problem has not gone away. The changes that we've had not dealing with anything like the majority of the problem, and we need to be active on this to get the change that we really need and that we ought to have.
It almost sounds like a call to political action.
Well, it definitely is. I mean, it's people used to say the personal is the political. It's kind of a slogan a few years back. And that's true. So it's personal. Are you participating in this cruelty to animals by, for example, buying animal products or not? So it's partly those individual choices, but it is also a call to get political, because that's the only way we're going to get the real change that we want. We're going to get, we can grow the number of people who don't consume animal products and who are not participating in this cruelty by a few percent. I think that's happened over the years. But to really get the changes that we want to see, we are going to have to get political.
All right. In discussing the attitudes and the industries that perpetuate animal exploitation, in the book you write, against these ancient prejudices, powerful vested interests, and ingrained habits, do animal advocates have any chance at all? Do they have anything in their favor other than reason, morality, and a limited amount of empathy for some animals? So answer that question for us here. Where do you think the animal rights movement stands today, and are you hopeful?
I'm certainly not giving up hope. I do think that reason, morality, and empathy can move us. And I also think that the technologies that are producing the alternatives to meat are going to help. And once they scale up and become more economically competitive, or perhaps when the rival animal products are forced to price in those externalities that we talked about before, then I think we will see a bigger shift. So, yes, I do think this change is coming, and I want to be part of that change, but it's a very big change, and it's going to take a long time before we get there.
Well, let me ask you one question about a technology that everyone seems to be talking about these days, and that's AI. Is there any AI application that might help or hurt the animal rights movement?
Well, I think the general answer to whether AI is good or bad is that it has some good sides and some bad sides, and this is no less true in the animal movement than it is when we're concerned with humans. So, yes, it can help. It could, for example, help to screen drugs so that we don't have to test them on animals. Could be a very accurate and useful way, and much faster and cheaper.
It can do that? AI has that capability of screening drugs?
It certainly has the capability of telling us, you don't need to bother testing these drugs on an animal because it's not going to be good for the animal and it's not going to be good for the human. So, yes, it could dramatically reduce the number of drugs we need to test on animals. And I hope eventually it could eliminate entirely. But I think, again, it will be some time before it eliminates it. But it certainly has the potential to reduce it. It may also have the potential to help us with the development of alternative proteins, to find ways in which we can do that more cheaply and a greater variety of them than we have now. But on the other hand, it has some negative possibilities. AI is increasingly being used in factory farming, not so much in the United States yet. China is a leader in using AI in factory farming, but I think it's true in Norway. And that is enabling the production of huge factory farms where humans basically don't see the animals at all. And while you might say, okay, well, that's good because we've seen these horrendous videos of lowly paid workers who take out their frustrations on the animals, and the AI won't do that at least. But I think it will enable even more crowding and confinement, and it may reduce the cost of producing animal products through factory farming, and that it will again make it harder for the alternatives to compete. So that's going to be a negative side of AI for animals.
Boy, I was just thinking off the top of my head about artificial intelligence. I didn't really think there was an AI application, good or bad, in the issue of animal rights. But you just proved me wrong. I mean, AI in factory farming. I guess sure you have robots doing it, or computers, or something that makes the production of meat more efficient. The corporations are going to go for it.
Absolutely, they are. And by the way, one quite obvious example of AI and animals is as we get self-driving cars, are they going to be programmed to brake hard or swerve to avoid an animal on the road, or are they only going to be programmed to avoid humans on the road? That will be a real test of the speciesism of the car manufacturers and the AI designers.
Now, you brought that up, not myself. So if I did, I would have thought that was a joke. But you're bringing it up. That's a moral philosopher's viewpoint that it could happen.
Oh, I think it will happen. I think we will get there, and that will be the question: how are they designed and how are they programmed? To be only concerned with humans or to be concerned with animals as well?
Well, Peter, I appreciate you coming on the PETA podcast to talk about these issues. Before we go, are there maybe 3 things that you can you want to let people know that are the 3 most important things to consider in this next generation of animal rights? Because that's how they really should view this new version or this new iteration of animal liberation. It's really a new generation for the animal rights movement, isn't it?
It definitely is a new generation. That's right. So obviously, I would like people to order the book. You can pre-order it already on Amazon. It's called Animal Liberation Now. You can book your tickets for the speaking tour that I mentioned if you can get to LA, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, or New York. Or if you're listening to this in London, I'll be speaking in London as well because the book will be out in the UK too. And if you want to book tickets, you can go to Think Inc., so think and then inc.org.au, because it's being run by an Australian organiser. An Evening with Peter Singer, if you search for that, or if you just go to thinkinc.org.au, you'll be able to find where you can get tickets. Please do come and spread the word. And then, more generally, of course, I want people to be part of this new generation that is concerned about animals, that is concerned about the planet, that is concerned about climate, that is concerned about preventing new viruses emerging from factory farms. That's another issue we haven't talked about. So get with that and, think about what you're eating, think about how to eat in a way that's best for animals and for the planet and for yourself and your own health, and make that change and become part of that new generation, which takes up this issue and I hope brings a solution to all of these problems we've been discussing.
Right. Peter, you mentioned that this about changing your habits and changing your eating, but is it possible that this could be the one thing that a person can do in his or her life that could make the biggest impact on the climate and all these other ancillary future issues just by not eating meat?
It really is a huge thing that people can do for those issues, yes. And I do say that, give details in Animal Liberation Now, that, many people have thought, well, I eat locally and this is a good thing to do because it's better for the planet. The food doesn't have to travel so far. There's less fossil fuels. But it's much, much more important what you eat than where it comes from. The fossil fuel, or let's say the climate change contribution, the greenhouse gas contribution of beef is, 98% of that is coming from the animal as the animal lives. And whether it comes, whether it's your local beef producer or whether it comes across the country or even from Argentina or somewhere like that, might add 2 or 3% to the greenhouse gas footprint of the meat that you're consuming. But it's much more important to not be eating that beef at all than to say I'm eating locally.
Yeah. So all those things you mentioned, you can buy the book, pre-order the book, you can go to the speaking tour, you can do all these things. Yes. But the one thing that a person listening to this now can do, if they really want to make an impact on the climate, the society, the world, simply stop eating meat.
That is definitely one important thing. But I do want to say, as this is a PETA podcast, become political, get with an organization. PETA has been around since almost the beginning, actually. I mean, Ingrid Newkirk kindly says that she was inspired to found it by reading the first edition of Animal Liberation, and I'm very proud that I've contributed to all that PETA has done in that way. And I'm delighted that PETA is supporting the speaking tour and the book. Will make the book available to members and supporters of PETA at a significant discount. So you can get it that way too. Please do. And I really admire the work that PETA has done and is continuing to do. And supporting PETA is another important thing for everybody to do.
Okay, stop eating meat, support PETA. Those two things. They can do those two things, and then they'll save the world.
Right. I think that's right. You can do it. If we get enough people, tell your friends to do the same, of course. It's got to spread. We've got to make this viral, and then it can spread.
Well, Peter Singer, once again, thank you for joining us on the PETA Podcast.
Thank you. It's been terrific talking with you.
Author, philosopher Peter Singer. His new update of his classic Animal Liberation Now can be ordered on Amazon. And his speaking tour begins spring of 2023 in Los Angeles, San Francisco, DC, New York, and London. Go to Think Inc., that's THINKINC.org, thinkinc.org.au for ticket information. Get all that ticket information in our show notes as well. That's our show for today. Hey, thank you for listening. Don't forget to send a link of this show to your friends. Tell them you like the PETA Podcast. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok. That's EMILAMOK. Or see my vlog at amok.com. Or see my work at ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. That's ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog. Or get this podcast on YouTube. That's right, you can get it on YouTube at youtube.emilAMOK1. Yeah, you can listen to us and look at the rabbit with his earphones on YouTube at Emil Amokwan. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can subscribe to, as well as rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by CarbonWorks. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.